Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Rail Natter. It is episode 265. I'm delighted that Chris Brownbill is waiting in the green room. We'll join Chris momentarily. We are, of course, going to be talking about all things Australian railways today. Yes, it's a picture of some kangaroos, some kids, some turquoise seas, some white sands, the glorious stuff that you might associate with Australia. But we're going to burst some bubbles on this and do a pretty decent roundup of Australian railway history, along with some of the reasons why it is like that, and with a follow-up part two coming fairly soon, talking about the future of Australian railways. Before we do that, we must, of course, talk about Patreon, because without you, this show simply could not exist. You lovely Patreon supporters, of which several of you have joined very recently on the £5 and above tier. That tier gets you Q&A sessions, it gets you first dibs on event tickets, it gets you a free How the Rails Will Fix the Future audiobook, behind-the-scenes previews, many delicious things. But crucially, it also gets you a weekly bonus Rail Natter short where I will answer in some detail a question that you Patreon supporters have set. And the first of those is happening tonight. It is happening tonight at 9:30. What are we covering tonight? We're covering whether you can cross the Atlantic with a bridge. Is this possible? Is it possible to build a fixed link? Let's not just say bridge. Let's say a fixed link across the Atlantic. How realistic is it to do this? That we will be covering, and you get that if you pay £5. So we're launching the bonus tonight. If you haven't already, sign up. Without further ado, welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. And as the Intercity 225 fades away, Chris is here. Chris, an absolute delight to have joined you. In my new and exciting visual setup means that I don't have to press 150 buttons. People get the delight of seeing you immediately. But before we next to us also, as in the spirit of the episode, this is, I believe, in fact, you tell me what we're looking at next to us right now on screen. I'm pointing this way, but it's actually over here. What's on screen right now, Chris? Before I introduce you, you must introduce this locomotive, this fantastic looking, this whole train is rather beautifully stitched together. What is it?
Thank you, Gareth. Yes, that is the Spirit of Progress, which was introduced by the Victorian Railways in 1937 as the express train between Melbourne and Albury, and it connected at Albury. It was a broad gauge train, and it connected at Albury with overnight sleeping car trains to Sydney. So it was the height of transport between Australia's two largest cities in the 1930s, and obviously it was streamlined, and
it seriously goes. There is a streamlining effect. It's because of the broad gauge. It's got a particularly steampunk sort of aesthetic. And of course the Victorian Railway, the classic winged railway logo, but sort of modernised with the VR at the front. It's very nice. So we've introduced a train, which is rude, because actually what I should have done is ensured, Chris, that I've introduced you first. Chris Brownbill, please introduce yourselves to people you're a long-time friend of the show, but introduce yourself to the people watching and listening.
My name's Chris Brownbill. I'm not a rail professional, but I am a long-time rail enthusiast, rail fan, photographer. And I run the Australian Rail Maps website, which I've been doing for longer than I would like to. 29 years, I'll admit how long I've been doing that. And I've been interested in trains since, apparently, my parents told me since I was a baby, and we lived across the street from a railway station. I used to lie in my cradle and watch the trains go by.
Fab.
And it's been forward ever since.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of work through this narrative, and we start, as stories usually do, at the beginning. You've rightly said, what is Australia, and a chance to tell us what it is, and more importantly, whose it was first, I suppose, might be a pertinent thing to describe.
I think that's right. I think Australia, perhaps maybe surprising to a lot of people, has had one of the longest continuous settlements of humans anywhere in the world. We're not too sure, but somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years of continuous settlement from the indigenous people who first arrived, via Indonesia and Papua all those years ago. I don't know how that compares to Europe. I think it's only 10,000 or something in Europe. I don't know.
Much older. Absolutely, a much older, longer populated part of the world than Europe. Yeah, absolutely.
And as that map in front of us shows, there's a few things there. The two flags up the top, the black, yellow, and red flag is the flag of the Aboriginal Australia. It symbolises the sun, the red earth, and the dark night sky. And the other flag to its right there, the green, blue, and white, is that's the flag of the Torres Strait Islanders, who are a second set of Indigenous Australians that not many people know about. They're actually Melanesian, and they live at the very, very tip of Queensland, right up the top there at the pointy bit, and in the islands between Australia and Papua New Guinea. And they're quite different culturally, but they've been here almost as long. And you'll see those two flags flying all over Australia these days, along with the national flag, which is the one down the bottom there, which has got the top left corner has something that a lot of our British viewers will recognise.
Boo! Yeah, it's a colonial flag. Everyone, there's no avoiding what this flag represents.
Today, I'm coming to you from the land of the Kurnow people, which is in the far bottom right corner of the mainland there. See, there's a tan-coloured area. That's exactly right. Yeah, and for example, it wasn't when I went there, but the high school was known later as Kurnow College after them. So
that's specifically this area that we're talking about, I believe.
That's right, and that's just one of 100. And I don't know how many there are there actually, but a lot of language and groups. So after the Indigenous people, we've also had mariners and traders from Papua from about 600 BCE. China, there are records that in about the 1400s, some Chinese people came.
Interesting,
Zhong Hu, I think it was, who was an explorer. People from Portugal in the 1500s, Spain 1500s, Netherlands 1600s, and then permanent traders from the Makassar in 1700s. So they started trading from Indonesia, from the north there, with the people at the north coast, and then obviously we had the colonial era from 1788 and waves of migration, which you could break into pre-Second World War and post-Second World War, and then 21st century. And it was originally, a lot of it was European, obviously, but then post-Second World War, there was certainly a lot of Southern Europeans. But also, given our proximity to Southeast Asia, we got a lot of Vietnamese people, obviously, for obvious reasons. And the Vietnamese community has been fantastic. It's just been brilliant for Australia. Not only just for food, but
selfishly because the food got very good. Yeah, okay,
and in the 21st century, more from East Africa and so on. And our population now is about 27.5 million, so of which about 31% are overseas born.
Interesting. Okay, So this leads us to a little list that you made about some of the, let's say, myths about Australia as a country. And I think we've already busted the first one. We don't need to go. But the idea that Australia is a young country, there's a strong nope on that one, right? The next one, we're mostly descended from British convicts.
No, about 20% can trace their lineage back there. So
that's a nope. So mostly outback and small towns.
No, we're one of the most urbanised countries in the world, actually. In fact, we're the most urbanised large nation in the world. Urban and suburban, I might say. Most of us live in very large cities. There is a lot of outback, but most of us will go there for a holiday. We might go there once or twice, but we don't really go there.
So that's a decided nope. The next one is, admittedly, this one is a bit more in my head as being a bit. So I look forward to you busting this bubble, which is that Australia is full of deadly native animals, reptiles, and insects, and things of this nature. They all want to murder you horribly.
It would be interesting. I wonder how many people would realise what the animal in Australia that causes the most human deaths. I don't know whether you'd have. I haven't spoken to you about this, but
no, I wonder if something like the domesticated cat dog or something like this. It's because people might think of it as the kangaroo or something like that. But
Well, I'll tell you what, you're not too bad there. No, the most deadly is the horse.
Oh, horse. Okay, horse.
which is obviously
Oh yeah, but Outback is that connection to like the horse ride? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of horse racing and stuff. Second most deadly is cows. The dairy industry is,
cows are big and they don't notice you because they're busy.
That's exactly right. But they're also not unique to Australia.
Nope.
Third is dogs.
Yeah.
And fourth is kangaroos, but not because they're vicious. It's because we drive our cars at them.
Oh, and hit them and crash. Yeah. Okay.
That's exactly right. And as far as insects are concerned, people think of spiders. Well, the annual death rate from spiders is 0, and there hasn't been a death. There hasn't been a death from spider bites since 1979. So
really,
it's they're there, but again, because we don't live where they are.
It's not an issue. So that's a decided strong nope. The global backwater thing, I hopefully not too many people think this, because there's actually, I mean, even just in academic circles, there are a lot of extremely, if we think of that as a nexus for cultural prominence globally, which I think is not an unreasonable one. Australian academic activity is severely, back to when I was at Edinburgh, fire safety engineering had serious prominence in Australia as a major kind of output from several universities. In fact, Edinburgh being one of the world leading places, several of the key academics left and went, I think, to Sydney specifically for the fire safety engineering. I think it might be that. It could have been Melbourne. In any case, one of the top engineering universities in Australia. So from that perspective, certainly not true. But I'll let you fully bust this one, Chris.
Oh, well, I mean, you've done a fantastic job there, Gareth. But I think perhaps the biggest sign there is that we're not in the G7, but we do regularly attend the G7 as perhaps the 8th or 9th. And I think that's happening next week or somewhere in Canada, I think it might be, and our Prime Minister's headed off over there. So I think perhaps part of the problem is our own mindset.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And we don't think of ourselves as influential, but we're somewhere around about the size of Spain and Korea, something like that in terms of GDP.
Absolutely, so sizable. Yeah, it's like the opposite affliction to the UK, whereas like the sizable majority of the UK, or a sizable chunk of the UK population thinks we're still extremely influential on the global stage when we're decreasingly so year on year. So that's very much a nope. A classic. We're laid back and easygoing. Well, Chris, given it's taken me an hour and a half to get us going on this recording, I have to say you've not done a good job of bursting this bubble.
Well, we don't wear hats with corks on them, and the Barry Mackenzie did not do us any any favours. But no, we love to complain. We love to we love to criticise. But that's but we do have the tall poppy syndrome, which is we will criticise anybody who's successful. Anyone who gets too big for his boots, we'll chop him down.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah. Okay. So that's a nope. And then the last one, which obviously is pertinent to tonight's fun, which is we don't do railways much. Which, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to put a preemptive nope on that one, but we'll hold the answer to that hopefully for the rest of this episode and potentially one other going into modern railways shortly. So, Chris, thanks for busting some myths on that one, which is fun. But we must start when in the railway story in Australia. We start in 1831. Chris, this is where I let you pick up the reins and tell the tale.
Bit of a similar tale to what I understand is happening in the UK, where I think this year you're celebrating the 200th of this Stockton and Darlington. Which is causing a bit of controversy about whether is that the first railway or is it not? And I know you have your views on that. There's a similar situation in Australia. There are things. This thing was in Newcastle, the city of Newcastle in New South Wales, which was unsurprisingly a coal mining centre.
Yeah.
In 1831, there was a mining rail. It was a gravity worked cable incline thing that took coal from the mine, which is on a hill, down to a staith on the Hunter River, and I think they were hooked with two cables, and the empty one went down and pulled the full one went down, and the empty one pulled the empty one up. It was actually long forgotten, but it was in about the 1990s or something. People uncovered it. This guy down there is holding a section of what seems to be fish belly rail that he
it's a
dug up
nice
from
old
his backyard.
Yeah, it's good.
And so the city of Newcastle was very keen to call that Australia's first railway. Is it? Well, it was the first thing that was shaped like a railway, but it wouldn't be what we would call a modern railway today, obviously. But 1831, that's fairly early.
It is early. It's earlier than in my head. I know that Russia was pretty far ahead in the charge on railways, but outside of the UK and obviously the Low Countries and France got there quite quickly as well. The US quite quickly as well. But Australia's a decent distance away. And it's interesting that 1831 is pretty early. It's a year after the first modern railway, as I would argue it, in the UK. But I suppose this is so. This is the earliest record you have of anything of wagonways and similar, actually. So okay. So that in a way that's also quite late. So if we jump to 1836,
this is a fascinating thing. This was actually a convict powered railway built in Van Diemen's Land, or what we would now know as Tasmania, and it ran for 8 kilometres from near the convict settlement of Port Arthur to a place called Turana, and possibly, we're not sure, but might have run further to a place called Eaglehawk Neck, which was where the ships were able to dock. And it was, as far as we can tell, it was a wooden railed thing, and it was powered by convicts who pushed it. You can sort of see the illustration there.
Yep.
And they would ride down the hill, and they would carry goods and or officers and gentlemen, no doubt, whatever, to and from. There's no physical record of this, but there's only written records of it, and it lasted, I think, until about the 1870s. So it was gone by the 1870s at any rate. Nobody knows what gauge it was. You wouldn't call it a public railway by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a very unusual thing. Really.
Yeah, it is. It's strange, and it's the idea of you sat in your top hat, feeling smug about the world, as four guys with frankly dubious reasons to be locked up potentially, or in some cases maybe either it's a scruffy person who ought not to be there, or it's a murderer pushing your wagon along is slightly strange, but certainly not the last case, and certainly not the first case of indentured servitude being the way that you push the train around. But interesting. So then we jump to 1853, which is a fair old whack later. And we have, two things going on here. Firstly, a lovely bit of bridge rail that you've given us a nice slice of. But it's a tramway. This looks suspiciously like something that we had. 1807 was the first passenger, arguably the first public passenger railway in the Mumbles in South Wales. Old South Wales, that should be. Tell us about this. What's going on here?
Well, this was in Goolwa in South Australia, and it was built to broad gauge, and it was a horse-drawn tramway railway using, as far as I can, bridge rail. I was going to ask you whether that was bridge rail or Barlow rail. I don't know which it is, but I think it.
What? My gut would be to call it bridge rail. But
the purpose was, it was built from Australia's largest river is the Murray River, which runs from the high country in the east and south of New South Wales and east of Victoria, runs west, and it reaches the sea in South Australia at Goolwa, except it doesn't quite reach the sea. It actually empties into a lake called Lake Alexandrina, which, except when flows are really very heavy, doesn't actually even enter into the ocean. It just evaporates.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And there was, for many years, well until the 20th century, a paddle steamer industry that ran along the Murray River, a bit like the Mississippi, but on a much smaller scale, which took goods. And you could get it to Lake Alexandrina, but it needed a railway to take it across the short gap. It was about 11 kilometres to the port at Port Elliot. And this thing here was built to do that, and it became, so in that sense it was a public railway, but it wasn't locomotive hauled. It was built on metal rails, obviously. It was horse powered, and it remained horse powered until the 1880s, I think it was.
Yep.
So the South Australians, so we've got the South Australians who claim that as Australia's first railway. We've got the Tasmanians who claim the Convict thing as the first railway. And we've got New South Wales who claim the coal thing as the first railway.
Yeah, I was going to say, to put this all to bed, everyone, the first railway, if you're claiming the first railway, the thing to do is it a guided way? And do you have a fixed distance between rails? Then it doesn't matter who's powering it or what the legal structure is. It's a railway. So I have to go with the 1831 railway. I would go with as the first. But I'd be fascinated to know if there's some older, is there an older wagon way, even like logway or rutways being used as part of mining earlier than that? Because and again, it's one of those situations. Another valid reason for us mentioning the indigenous populations earlier on is that the idea that you don't have guided way technologies are kind of a natural human endeavor actually for moving masses. So it'd be, and as indigenous history is severely underexplored by us with a very kind of Western centric view of things. So I'd be interested to dig into that a bit more.
I know that some of the outback roads are known to follow the paths that the indigenous people used, and that in turn is based on celestial navigation.
Fascinating. Well, similar to the the east of the Great Road, the Great Way, the Great Path on the eastern seaboard in the US are thousands and thousands of year old paths, and that was following buffalo routes. The indigenous populations, the Native Americans, following buffalo routes and creating their permanent pathways that way. So but anyway, so we know that the railways have been around in a nominally modern-looking form almost as long as they have in the UK. Accepting that the railways have been in the UK since the 1500s. So interesting little beginnings bit there. But the story doesn't stop there. So that was 1853, 1854. What's happening?
Well, 1854 this would be our closest equivalent, I suppose, to the Liverpool and Manchester. And this was the Melbourne to Sandridge railway, which is only 4 kilometres long. Melbourne, or Sandridge is Port Melbourne. It's now known as Port Melbourne. It used to be known as Sandridge. And this was a broad gauge railway, which was built by a private company to connect Melbourne and that station there. It's a drawing of the opening day, and that is what is Flinders Street Station, Melbourne Flinders Street Station, which is still operating today. So that makes it Australia's longest established railway station. As we know, it doesn't look much like that now, but it still has broad gauge trains, and so that was the first modern railway in the Liverpool and Manchester sense to open in Australia. It was the first to open. But so this gives the Victorians a claim to Australia's first railway, and for many, 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 many years, indeed, it was common wisdom that this was Australia's first railway.
Oh, interesting.
But then the arguments started, and it was very parochial, of course.
People get passionate about this. I don't mind people getting passionate about it for the interesting history, but people just get geographically passionate about it and like, no, it's mine, which is I'm less interested in, which is a shame. Very briefly, very interested to see. Got to be one of the earliest or a very early depiction of a curved platform actually here, which is fascinating actually. Seeing, it's a wooden. You can see it's wooden, because you've got the dotted lines, the kind of the faint lines showing planking. But very interesting to see a curved platform, particularly on broad gauge. Yeah, interesting.
I don't know why, although the line behind the train, that would have just arrived, that train, if I've got my positions right. And you can see over to the left there's it's actually a bridge. It goes over the Yarra River. So it immediately turns and runs on a skew over the river down to the port, which would be over the horizon in the background. So it may have had something to do with that, but the platforms at Flinders Street today are not curved.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, very interesting. And you see there's one track that's got the sleepers visible, which is interesting. But the adjacent track, it's a double track railway here, is fully buried up, which is also quite, it's in the style that was much more traditional of the day, which is where you put the ballast right up to the railhead, or just short of it, which is interesting. So
I don't know how accurate the artist or how familiar they probably wouldn't have been very familiar with railways.
Well, it's quite an honest representation. I quite like it. So that was 1854. So then 1855, we have a much more familiar looking image here.
Yeah, this is the 1855 was the opening of the Sydney to Parramatta Railway, which was 22 kilometres long, standard gauge railway, and it did open a year after the Melbourne to Sandridge Railway, but construction started before it. But it took a lot longer. It's a bigger project.
Yes.
So there's no doubt that the Melbourne one opened before this. But the Sydney people will say, but we started this.
We started first, yeah.
And they were probably running, interim services when it was under construction. So yet again, you've got the...
absolutely.
Fair dues, this line today is operating. It's one of the busiest lines in the country between Sydney and Paramea is a very, very major suburban centre in Sydney, 22 kilometres to the west. And there's a lot of trains along that line today.
Yeah, and it's for me. The first isn't necessarily that interesting, and battling over the first isn't that interesting. There are elements of why things are first that can be interesting, but actually fighting hard for the first is less interesting than understanding the nuances and subtleties. Yeah, that's so we've had our beginnings. Then we have to. You've mentioned standard gauge, which is the reason we called the damn track gauge standard gauge is because we had by this point had a realization of 1846 is when the Gauge Act was passed in the UK, which did roll out internationally as a both deliberately and inadvertently. Standard gauge being called that was because we'd realized by this point that the railways were networks of networks, systems of systems, and so expansion, I'm sure it reflected that, right, Chris? We didn't end up in a situation where we had multiple gauges, right? Anyway, before we talk about that, let's talk about the Constitution.
Well, one of the things, people may not be aware, but Australia was originally it was 6 separate colonies until 1901, when we federated to become a nation. And so it was around 1899, 1900 when the Australian Constitution was being written. And obviously in those days, railways were a very significant piece of technology, And as a result, we've got a number of mentions in our constitution about railways, which is probably not the case for most countries.
Yeah.
But it's a product of when we were federated. And so it talks about the legislative powers of the Parliament. You can see there, Part 5, Section 51. The Parliament shall have power to make laws for peace, order, and so on, to do with the control of railways with respect to transport for the naval and military purposes for the Commonwealth, and for the acquisition of with the consent of a state, for goodness sake, of any railways of the state on terms arranged between the Commonwealth and the state. And similarly, there's a guarantee of freedom of trade between the states, which we've often taken for granted, but I notice is causing Canada, the absence of that is causing Canada a bit of a problem at the moment, in that they have barriers between their provinces. We don't have that.
Yes.
Yeah. And thank you, Section 98, I guess, of the Constitution for that. But again, it specifically mentions railways there, so there must be no barrier to trade with railways. I just thought it was nice.
It is interesting. So it's because this is second guessing what Europe has ended up doing with various elements of rail. But it's interesting that is it some of the first federalization and constitutionalization of railway, of the relationship between railways between states. It's actually quite significant and interesting. The way it's been codified is something that is very early on for this type of
it is in some ways. I guess Australia in that era is a bit like the EU. We were a federation of colonies, and it was very, very parochial. But the Constitution actually did pull it together, although it's probably been more in the late 20th century. We've really come more closely together to our benefit. But yeah, so it's I think what the mentions in the Constitution show is the significance with which railways were treated. But perhaps just as significantly, the Federation, the only reason that Western Australia actually voted in the referendum, which was in 1899 or 1900, I can't remember which, to join the Federation, was with a guarantee that we would build a railway across from the east to the west. they were not going to vote for to join the Federation, but the promise of a Commonwealth Railway from the east to the west was what tipped it. That and a lot of Victorians had gone over there to mine gold. People had gone from the Victorian Gold Rush had gone over to the Western Australian Gold Rush by then, so they took a bit of that. But so the Commonwealth Railways was a condition of federation, and it took us till 1917 to open that.
Yeah, yes, well, yeah, quite. And on which theme? So powers of the Constitution. We've alluded to standard track gauge and networks of networks. This picture would seem to undermine some of that systems thinking. We're looking at a picture of a variety of track gauges and a complex multi-gauge switch. I mean, it's fun metalwork, but it's a horror show. Chris, okay, tell us about track gauge.
Well. Fundamentally, we have three. I guess it's not unusual for countries to deal with differing gauges. I know the UK certainly had that with Brunel and so on, and the US as well. I know they had all various weird gauges, and Spain and Portugal, Russia and whatever. But mostly, a lot of that has been dealt with, I think, in a century or so ago, certainly in the UK, and not in Australia. We are still dealing with that today, and the problem is that from day one, the different states adopted different standards. So New South Wales adopted standard gauge, 1435. Victoria and South Australia adopted broad gauge, Irish gauge, 1600 millimetres. And Western Australia, Queensland, Tasmania adopted narrow gauge, 1067, which is Cape gauge, I guess. And the reasons for that are long and varied. It's the old story about an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman. Yeah,
exactly.
But you were right. And to be honest, it was a lot of miscommunication, and the time that it took requests and answers to get shipped back to the UK, to the Home Office or the Foreign Office or whatever it was, because the Australian standard was set at standard gauge. It was then, I think, as I understand it, which would have been in the 1830s or something. It was then there was a request can we change it to the Irish gauge because it would make it easier to build powerful enough locomotives, I believe. That request was sent off, and that was approved. But then it was changed again by the Sydney to Paramea Railway. But by that time, the Victorian and South Australian railways had started with their broad gauge. And there was even a broad gauge in Tasmania. The first railway in Tasmania was actually broad gauge, but that changed later too. And ever since then, until really the 1960s, that really didn't change. And what you've got there, that's actually a transitional state. That photograph is from South Australia. South Australia really copped the raw end of the stick. That's from a place called Gladstone, which is it's a very British sounding name. It's a couple of 100 kilometres north of Adelaide. It was traditionally a narrow gauge town. It was a
1067,
1067. The railways around Adelaide, however, they were built to broad gauge, the 1600. And the South Australian government had a program of converting their narrow gauge railways to broad gauge. The broad gauge reached Gladstone in, I think it was the 1920s or 30s. I think I'm not sure about that. I should know that because my grandfather's from up that way. But and then what happened in 1970? But that left a lot of narrow gauge north thereof and east.
Yes.
But then in 1970, the east-west standard gauge came through and it ran through town. So it added a third gauge to town. So there was a triple gauge.
My goodness.
So it had this. And this was in place until, this is no longer the case. This is a purely standard gauge town now. But this was taken in about 1970 and it lasted until the late 80s in that sort of...
Yeah, and it's one of these stories where, a separate episode will pick it up. Differing gauges is a route to not necessarily the right choices being made when it comes to the inevitable mid to late 20th century rationalizations, is that decisions about what should be rationalized follow, well, the track's already the right gauge, so we'll keep that, rather than this is the right place to continue to have a railway functioning. We won't get into it, but I'm sure there's tales galore of that in the hinterland places around Australia. Yeah.
So suffice to say that, and on top of that, I might add, we also have significant amounts of narrower gauges too for specific purposes, most notably Queensland sugarcane railways or tramways.
Yes.
To this day, 610 millimetre, and there's still a remarkable amount of that to this day.
The sugarcane, now, catch me if I believe there are drawbridge crossings on the sugarcane railways. In fact, particularly one or two particularly famous examples crossing a mainland railway. I think I've been sent them, possibly by you, Chris, actually.
Oh, yes, it's quite remarkable, and it's one of Australia's. Those railways carry significant traffic too.
Yes, yeah.
And go and run for long distances. So and there were even a couple of other. There's Puffing Billy. You might have heard the Puffing Billy steam railway in Victoria. That's 762 millimetre.
Oh yeah,
I think that is.
That's which is not quite, but nearly Austro-Hungarian, like Austrian gauge. That 760. That's 760. Oh no, I'm misremembering. Because that's 1,000 mil. Oh, 760. Yeah, 760 is one of the classics for urban gauge. Actually, you find a lot of tramways that are 760.
Yeah, well, there were four of those railways in the hilly parts of Victoria, and two of them survive as tourist railways.
Oh, really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. People will tell me what the Imperial 762, what that is in Imperial, but I don't mind. Right. So. So expand this chapter, if you like, is about expansion. So we start with an image, which we're showing the different gauges here quite nicely, actually. So in red you've got the 1067. In blue down in the bottom corner you've got the broad gauge, the 1600 mil, the superior gauge. Some might point out. You can see the little snippet of 762 gauge actually down here. There's a little bit of 762 here in yellow, and then some of this 610 narrow gauge along the coast up on the kind of in the northeast as well. And then in black is the standard gauge, which you'll see is not the majority. Some of the strategic bits of railway absolutely are there in standard gauge, but not the majority. And again, the Alice Springs line is shown here in narrow gauge in 1067.
Yeah, well, this is as the network was in approximately 1950.
Okay.
So this was sort of kind of close to its maximum extent. But what you can see is that it's very much geographically distributed based upon states.
Yeah.
Western Australia's standard gauge, New South Wales is Western Australia's narrow gauge, Queensland is narrow gauge, Tasmania in the inset is narrow gauge, New South Wales is standard gauge. Victoria and South Australia were broad gauge, but the outer parts of South Australia were narrow gauge.
Yep.
And there was the Commonwealth line between Port Augusta at the head of Spencer Gulf there and Kalgoorlie. That was the thing built in 1917 to get Western Australia to join the Union. That was then isolated really from the rest of the standard gauge network. You can see how balkanised it all was, even to the extent there's isolated bits of narrow gauge down in Western Victoria or in South Australia. Which was converted about a year or two after this.
Yeah, so that's 1950. We jump forwards to...
That is today.
Yeah.
So you can see evidently there are fewer railways than there once were. But you can also see how standard gauge has extended. We're now connected not only east-west right the way across, Melbourne down to the south and Melbourne to Adelaide. Those lines have been converted to Melbourne to Sydney, Melbourne to Adelaide, and the north-south transcontinental line up to Darwin. Which was built new in about 2002 or something like that. I think that was. Might have been before. I can't remember the exact date. And importantly, for discussions later on, over in the northwest there, a large amount of standard gauge, which are the private iron ore railways.
Now, I was going to say, that's a pattern of railway expansion that will be familiar to many. In fact, it's a pattern not dissimilar to the rest of the Australian network, but particularly this is a familiar pattern to the west and east of the African continent. Particularly in the central part of the African continent, familiar to anyone in South Wales, old South Wales, that is. Yeah. This is mineral extraction. This is colonialised mineral extraction railways, and for better or worse, that's what's going on in that part of Oz. I'm going to flick back and forth briefly to show people, so people can sort of see the difference. So what's interesting is the old route to Alice Springs is gone. The transcontinental north-south is an entirely new route, So old route completely gone. In fact, I'm sure you can trace that along in the outback, though. It's still mostly there, I'd imagine. But the new route showing, and you can see not much change other than the cropping of fringe railways in the northeast. A
lot of the branch lines, obviously.
Branch lines tightening, and then but actually a tremendous loss in southern Australia, actually.
Yeah, Victoria, significant loss. That is the more densely populated area, but a lot of those were built for serving grain. A lot of them.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Grain lines, and they still are to this day. Those that remain, you can see to northwestern Victoria, the broad gauge lines.
Yeah.
They carry grain to this day, but all of those others are gone, and quite a few lost everywhere, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
but it's crucially the remains of a strategic network still in place.
Oh yeah.
There's some. Yeah, there's certainly some. I would argue some missing strategic links, but you can see the sort of the shape of and the scale. People have to understand the scale at play here. We are looking at an absolutely enormous landmass. People often don't appreciate the scale of the landmass we're talking about. It's huge.
It's not far short of the landmass of the United States.
Yeah.
And if you want to place it, the Victoria, which is the south, roughly where the broad gauge is, that is roughly the size of England down there. Yeah. The span of that.
This sort of nominally, it's a horrible border scribble that I've done there, but nominally that's sort of the bit down there. Yeah. And also, you've got the railways still in Tasmania, right? You've got the
yes. There's no passenger lines there, but they do. They haul. There's ore extraction, and there is some multimodal stuff.
Oh yeah.
And there's a little bit of coal.
I'll clear my scribble so people have a clear picture. But there we go. So that's, and then if we jump forwards, we have you've yellowified some of this. So tell me this is, I presume this is the passenger railway,
this is
right?
This is right. This is today's passenger railway.
Yeah.
So you can see it's only on something of it. Well, at the national level, there is a lot more detail within the cities, which we'll get onto later. But these are the railways that carry passenger trains today. Probably the most famous ones are the Indian Pacific, which goes from Sydney to Perth, east-west. You can see that there. That is, if you have a lot of money, you may you can afford to travel on that. I can't. But I'm talking $multi-thousand to take a trip across there. Didn't used to be that day. I did travel on it from Adelaide to Sydney once in many years ago when it was an ordinary train, but these days not so much. And similarly, Adelaide to Darwin, north-south. Those are probably the most famous passenger trains. But so they are really land cruisers. Really, they're not what people take for travel. But the rest of it is. The rest of it are where people go to get to a place. So we have, and most of it is based out of the major cities. So you can see Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne on the east coast there. They have radiating services.
Yeah, so you've Brisbane, you've got Sydney, you've got Melbourne. Yeah. It's weird to see Canberra as an offshoot, but anyway. But I suppose Canberra's not actually that large a spot. And then Adelaide again. You can see it's a bit of a hub.
There's not much in the way of long distance training. There's a few lines there.
So there's the the sort of the shape of passenger railway operations today. But we'll talk a little bit more about passenger operations in versus freight operations in a moment. But that's the shape today. One thing we haven't touched on, and we're going to touch on it more in what will be the second. There'll be a second bit to this where we talk about the state of the modern railways and the future for Australia's railways. But briefly, I want to touch on historic story of, because these are railways, folks, tramways, the urban railways, the urban railways in the form of on-street tramways. So, tell us a bit, Chris. Yeah, tell us a bit about this.
Yeah, well, Australia had 13 electric tram networks in its heyday, which was from between the 1920s and the 1950s. It was started in the 1889, I think. Was the first one. This was an area of a lot of influence, American influence, actually, in the design, with the exception of Hobart. I've put that up at top left there, which is a very British-looking system.
It is, yes.
But that was the odd one out, really. Everywhere else was much more American influence. And it was possibly due to the cable trams, which came beforehand. We had a lot of. Melbourne actually had the world's largest cable tram network, which is possibly something that's not well known. And that lasted till 1940, but it was converted, to electric tramway network, which actually survives today as the largest electric tramway network in the world. And what you've got down the bottom there of the screen is that is a W2 class tram, probably one of Melbourne's most famous exports. I actually took that shot in about 1987, I think that was, and it was those trams had largely been withdrawn by that time, but there was a piece of industrial action on a particular weekend, which was stopping the modern trams being repaired, and so they hauled out everything from the depots, including the old W2 that hadn't been upgraded with turn lights or safety indications or anything, and they ran it. So it was a fantastic weekend for photography.
So I mean, my knowledge of Australian trams essentially revolves around the film Malcolm from the late 80s. Which is good. Which I haven't watched it in years, so I'm not confidently going to recommend it to people in case it's a. But I remember it being I enjoyed it, but it's one of those where if I watch it back, will I cringe for various moments in it? But anyway,
Possibly, yeah, I enjoyed that one.
I enjoyed it too, but the main character in that is one of us, let's say, and has a fascination with tram cars. So your characterization is very. It is familiar to me of my understanding of the story, which is that it is following the US style of although the extent of interurbans is not, you didn't have that as a story overlaid into Australian Railway story. It's not, that didn't happen.
No, we didn't. Well, not until now, actually. Interestingly, there's what happened was by 1972, all but two networks were closed. So we only had two networks left. There was the very large network in Melbourne, and a single line in Adelaide, which had a little bit of interurban flavour into it, which is why it survived. It was only 15 kilometres or so, but it ran off-road all the way. But from 1997 until December last year, there have been 5 new light rail.
Modern LRT, if you like.
Whatever. I don't care what they call it, as long as they
it's built.
In Sydney, Gold Coast, Newcastle, Canberra, and Parramatta, and they are fantastic. And the one in Gold Coast in particular does actually have flavour of an interurban, a modern interurban actually, and it's still being extended and. Indeed, it may even cross the border into New South Wales one day. It may end up going for something like about 50 kilometres if it reaches its full length. So, which is it's quite a modern, it's quite a spectacular line actually. High speed, very very modern. But certainly Sydney's re-embraced trams. And that has been very successful for the Sydney. It's reinvigorated the main former traffic sewer into what is now a very delightful environment with trams.
Yeah, and we might touch more on that in our kind of part 2 episode on the way that but suffice to say, in terms of what history gave us, this is several pretty decent tram systems that have of which two, as you say, two have survived, one in pretty good state and the other was quite minimal to start with. What survived was minimal, but it continues to this day. Yeah. So now, as we get closer to kind of the end of this tale, there are a few things you wanted to highlight in terms of and we touched on it with Trams there, actually, the relationship between the Australian Railway story and the rest of the world. So, Chris, I'll let you run us through these.
Well, yeah, thank you. I wanted to talk a bit about where we've had our rail influences, and clearly from the United Kingdom, from the mother country, if you will. The XPT there is possibly the most well-known modern example of a technology that we've inherited from the UK, the power cars were certainly Paxman Valenta based on the HSTs. The passenger cars, not so much. They're actually Bud cars, really. But also from the UK, we had a lot of early engineers, people from the Midland Railway, who'd trained under Stevenson and so on. So some of our railways look a little bit like the Midland Railway, actually.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, they safe working, signalling, terminology, up, down, sleepers, things like that.
Yeah.
So each of the state capital city is up, and everything away from the state capital city is down. So it's the same as Britain, which I don't believe is an American thing. But a lot of manufacturers, we gave a lot of business to companies, particularly, both before and after the Second World War. I think we felt a certain duty to help boost the companies over there. So a lot of stuff built by Bayer Peacock, Walkers, AEC, Leyland, North British, English Electric, Hunslet.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, there's some of the final orders that before these companies collapsed into disintegrated into dust. So
they were building steam locos for us until 1953. So which was probably not the greatest decision.
No, well, yeah, join the queue of Anglophone countries making poor railway traction decisions. But anyway, yeah.
The US, obviously, there's a couple of bulldog nose GM locomotives there on the right. That was taken at Canberra Station. We had quite a few of those from the 1950s, obviously, when dieselisation came along. But we also had influence before then. We never used bullhead rail. We went straight to. We did. Obviously, you saw before we had the
fish rail. The bridge rail and the fish belly.
And we did use a little bit of double-headed rail, but we never used bullhead rail. We never used bullhead. We went straight to the American influence. Double stack, knuckle couplers. We imported a number of American administrators in the early 20th century to lead our railways, and they had significant influences on the design, particularly in South Australia, also perhaps in Victoria. They introduced American carriage design. They increased the size and power of the locomotives. Built Adelaide Station, which is, to all intents and purposes, New York's Grand Central.
Yes.
So, so there's a lot of stuff like manufacturers, obviously EMD, Alco, Brill, Budd, Pullman, Whitcomb, Bombardier. A lot of train names. We built, things like the Overlands and so on, which were named from American things. Contactless fare systems in the modern day. And even today, the venture capitalists, the American venture capitalists, they're the owners of the Union Pacific and the gang we spoke about before. So we're still having American influence. More modern, Asia into the 21st century. The bottom left picture there, that's a modern Melbourne electric train, high-capacity metro train. That's Chinese made, CRRC. We've also got Hyundai, Hitachi. And we've had some franchise operations, MTR from Hong Kong, and also some construction companies, Chinese construction companies. And Europe, bottom right there, people may not be aware, we do have a rack rail, a ski resort rack rail.
Yes.
And that's Swiss technology there. But it's also owned by a Japanese company. That's at Ski Tube Thredbo in southern New South Wales, which is just just getting into its annual season right now.
Yes, it's funny that a reminder, our planet has two hemispheres and they do different things. They're offset by half a year. So yeah, it's wintertime. It's not warm where you are right now, Chris. It's the evening and it's not warm. Outside, it's evening for you. It's morning for me. Although everyone watching this now, it's only about, you're only watching this about a day and a half after we're recording it, but it's morning for me. So the world, so there's this inheritance from the world. It's interesting. Those interconnections. The railways are never an isolated pocket and usually when they are, they end up disintegrating. Like, they are the railways are inherently an international story right from their earliest days. We've talked about expansion, we've talked about the international inheritance. We need to talk about one of the most pivotal and important moments in Australian railway history. And, well, you can tell us the story, but on the 18th of January 1977, Granville.
In 1977, what had happened, it was probably the low point of Australian railways. For many, many years, railways had been neglected through the 60s, with the growth of car culture and so on, and the investment had fundamentally been neglected. There was no votes in it, and the things were in a pretty dire state nationally. And what happened that day was a turning point, I think. There was a train from the Blue Mountains, which is a commuter train, passenger train, hauled by an electric locomotive. And it came from, I think it started at Mount Victoria, which is the peak of the Blue Mountains, probably about 2 hours west of Sydney. And it was running into Sydney to bring the commuters in. And it approached Granville, which on the photo that you can see on your left, the station platforms are just out of view to the right there. And up in the distance, the railway curves where it makes a sweeping left-hand curve. And the train came around. I don't think it was scheduled to stop at Granville, so it might have been going at decent speed. And it was negotiating that left-hand corner, and it jumped the tracks. And the locomotive hit the supporting pillar that was holding up the Bold Street Bridge, the overbridge, which used to be across the top there. And it weakened that bridge. The train then continued on a few of the carriages before it stopped. So the locomotive and about 2 or 3 carriages made it through. The train then stopped because it had derailed. And then it might have been a half a minute or a minute later, the weakened bridge then collapsed on top of the carriages, which were wooden bodied. And the end result was there were 84 fatalities recorded, and 213 people were injured. And it was a pretty traumatic day. It's the worst railway accident in Australian history, thankfully. And it was the root cause was investigated. People were determined to say, well, how could this happen? And the root cause was found to be underinvestment, cutting corners, and putting up with things that were unsafe. The bridge, apparently they discovered, for instance, that the bridge, when they built it, it didn't line up properly, so they reinforced it with concrete. They added a bit of concrete underneath it. So it made it heavier than it was supposed to be. The carriages, obviously, wooden bodied, way too old. Couldn't survive anything falling on top of them. The track, it was the wheel actually. I think it was the wheel on the locomotive was found to be the flange or something. Was found to be faulty, which caused it to derail in the first place. This actually led to a change of state government in New South Wales, and the incoming state government won election on the promise that they would fix this problem. They would not put up with this, and they would renew the railways. And so from that day forward, and indeed they did. And I think I can trace back, I think we can all trace back something of an inflection point in Australian railway history to that event. It's tragic that that's what it took, but it really did, it galvanised the nation. And
it's that moment. Yeah, it's one of those significant moments. This accident, the significance of the accident. Once again, politics becoming enwrapped with the railways, the changing government, but also critically this moment, this tragedy, a change in the fortune of a change in the direction, the orientation, a change in the fortune. As you say, the low point. But if it's a low point, it means that things got better after this point, which is really key. From Granville, we get another tale emerges, right? We come back to the XPT, which is so strange seeing this thing. Firstly, with its additional skirt. Secondly, it's quite heavy. It's reasonably modified compared to the original, what we'd call the Class 43. But it's very strange seeing it with bud cars. Small bud cars as well. Like, it's weird seeing it with mini bud cars, like sausage machined bud cars.
Well, it was part of the. It was part of the response to Granville, part of the modernisation program in New South Wales. The new Premier, Neville Wran, a Labor Party Premier, who probably really don't want to eulogise too much, to be quite frank, but given things that have been discovered since. He brought in a very charismatic leader for the railways and gave him the task and the funds to renew the railways. And his flagship project was to buy the XPT, which was based on the British HST, to take over, to replace all the vastly outdated long-distance rolling stock on the New South Wales railways. And he did that from 1981. The first cars hit the test tracks and they entered public service in 1982 on the Sydney to Dubbo route. And they were very, very, very well received. And indeed, they're still running today. That photo there was taken by me last year on a trip I made at... that was me getting off at Yass Junction as the train's heading away to Sydney on the right-hand track, because only one platform at Yass Junction is in use. So yes, they're still operating today. Today they operate still on the Sydney to Dubbo route, which you can see on the little map down the bottom. Those are the routes that it covers. Sydney is at the junction of the three red lines there, which are the XPT routes. Sydney to Dubbo, which is in central western New South Wales, it does a daily out and back from Sydney there. From Sydney up north to Brisbane. And also there are three trains a day up there, but the other two don't go all the way to Brisbane. They just stay within New South Wales. And then there are 2 trains a day between Sydney and Melbourne down the south. And the one is in daytime, one is overnight. And it does have sleeping cars, and I can thoroughly recommend a trip on the XPT sleeping car. It's an excellent trip, I must say. Better than I expected it to be.
Oh, marvellous.
They are, however, due for replacement. In fact, their replacement built by CAF are onshore now, but they are not yet in service, and I'm not quite sure what the story is. But
the usual.
Intriguingly, out of nowhere, there was an announcement a couple of months ago about a refurbishment of the XPTs, a life extension, and to give them 5 more years life. And nobody's quite sure what that means. Hopefully it means that we will get an increase in frequency.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's hope it's that rather than CAF doing the usual. So fingers crossed. Because I was going to say, those frequencies are useful in a kind of a mid-20th century way of like, I'm going to make my journey once, and that's fine. But like, those distances, don't get me wrong, they're large distances. But the distances we're looking at there that's kind of, now catch me if I'm wrong on this, kind of a little more, it's kind of like London, Glasgow, sort of, it's
a little more than that. I
was going to say, so like Sydney to Melbourne is one West Coast main line, right? Is that kind of the dimension, or is it even that a bit bigger?
Well, it's about 800 kilometres. As the crow flies, it's less, but you can see there's this big...
there's lots of weavy stuff going on,
and it winds around, and there's a fantastic story and why that's all the case too. But anyway, that's another matter.
Yeah.
And the one to Brisbane's even worse. That was built as a branch line, and it wasn't originally the main line. And it winds everywhere.
And this is the thing, like, these distances are ideally, I mean, we'll touch on this later. In fact, you know what? More on that in another episode. We'll come to what the future might hold for some of these routes and what they ought to do. But anyway, so the XPT came out of this, and as you say, it's still running successfully today, albeit there have been some challenges in its operation in recent years with incidents, thankfully not nearly on the scale of Granville. But yes, running well past its sell-by date, but still doing a sterling job.
And the incidents weren't the XPT's fault, I might say.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is as we kind of come to round off this. We've gone a bit long, but I don't mind that. We're kind of rounding off. What did we get? Good or bad or good?
We shouldn't sugarcoat it. There is only a low proportion of Australian intercity travel is by rail, and in fact, we're not fundamentally rail travellers, but we do have some decent city rail networks.
Yeah.
Our national patronage is probably only about 20%, I think, of what the UK's is. The journey to work mode share did peak at about 15% before COVID. It's a little less than that now, but we're finding that there's increased weekend travel, for example. In freight, only look, it's a shameful thing, but only about 2% of goods between Sydney and Melbourne goes by rail.
Yeah.
That is intermodal freight. It is better east-west. The longer distances, I forget, it's quite impressive. It's certainly above 50% over there. But there's a lot of potential for growth. We have 23,000 level crossings across the country, and only 21% of those have active protection. So
Yeah.
that is, that's a lot.
That's very much a big capital B bad on the network. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it is. 23, I mean, there's a lot of land, but gee.
Yeah.
Point-to-point times by rail are usually slower than by road, almost always. Just 11% of our track is electrified. 87% of our track distance is just single track.
Yeah.
And we have the mix of gauges. So we have 8% of it is broad gauge, 36% is standard gauge, and 56% is narrow gauge. So there's a lot there that are challenges. But to take a leaf from one of your very much earlier episodes, Australian railways can be good, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
I believe that we have more rail route per capita than any other country in the world. So we have 31,000 kilometres for a 27 million population. And I'd love for somebody to check me on this, but I believe that puts us ahead of Canada, who would be second.
Yeah.
And I don't believe there is any other country. So each of us has, I don't know, what's that? A metre or something of track.
Yeah, each. Yeah.
Each, but that's more than anywhere else in the world. So that is even with the network shrinkage we saw in that map before. More freight goes by rail than all other modes combined. A lot of that is the bulk extractive stuff.
Yes. We'll get to that in a second. Yeah. In fact, I'm going to put our face back up to show you that there is a graph that you have that shows something that I put up a second ago, but actually we wanted to highlight this particularly because it is interesting and it talks about the story and the good news story actually that you're highlighting. Yeah.
And a lot of that is because of those new railways up in the Pilbara in the northwest, which are the iron ore railways, and there are the world's longest and heaviest trains run there. I think there's the world record according to the Guinness Book of Records, 7.3 kilometres long for a train. I can't even imagine that, and 99,000 tonnes. So that is,
That's mind-boggling scale, and for better or worse, certainly when it's ore is like critical support. Of course, the coal trains are less. Ideally, those wouldn't exist. But this graph that you put up showed the growth in freight volumes by mode. Like, yes, there is growth in road, frustrating growth in road. And what is that? 50% growth. Well, not even that, 25-30% growth. But the rail growth is enormous. It's 150 to 450. So that's a nearly 300% growth. That's an enormous growth. And as you say, a lot of that up in the northeast. Northwest. Sorry, the northwest. Yes, the northwest of Oz. But there's this growth, and this kind of brings me to a point, Kristen, I wanted to kind of round off on as we close, which is people might be surprised to know that these two countries sit next to each other in the top 20. That's Australia and Japan. Now, Japan often gets talked about as having the world's best railways, but of course that's not true. It's not even necessarily true if you just look at passengers, but they have a very, very good passenger railway system and an almost non-existent freight rail system. And Australia kind of, we've talked about the successes of the passenger railway, but in terms of volumes and mode share, Australia kind of has the opposite, which is that it has an almost non-existent passenger rail sector from a mode share perspective. That's not the complete story, but from a freight perspective, the mode share overall, and that graph that you just put up explains why, it's massive. And so these are extremely unbalanced systems. In fact, if I jump to the data, I describe these as grossly imbalanced, but they sit at numbers 6 and 7. Japan at number 6 and Australia number 7 as two systems with greatly opposing types of system, and yet the two countries are next to each other. So Australia, it is not, it sits way above most of Europe, sits way above the US and the UK in terms of the effectiveness of its railway system. So if you had investment in improving the passenger railway system, to really pull up those numbers of the passenger railway system, and you'd actually get to the point where you have an extremely good railway system. And I suppose what I wanted to do is say, that's what we're going to talk about next time. What is being done to try and bring that mode share up across Australia, across the states of Australia? So I'm looking forward to talking about that in the future, Chris.
Look, thank you. It's been a privilege to be part of this, and I've learned a fair bit too just by putting this presentation together.
I suppose the thing that I want to say now is Chris, is plugging your website and what you do.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get rid of our faces and just say there's the website, so that which people can find at. What's the URL? They can Google it, I suppose. They just Google Australian rail maps and it will appear at the top.
Australian Rail Maps, or railmaps.com.au, and you'll find a cornucopia of information about Australian passenger railway travel, despite what we've just spoken about.
Yes.
And I've been running that for more years than I want to admit to. And you'll find maps, you'll find timetables. You can just use it to travel vicariously around Australia.
Fantastic. And so for my plugs, that interestingly not entirely un-Australia adjacent, because the first plug is to remind everyone that I had a joyous appearance on the FAB Thunderbirds podcast with Harry and Tom Brennan, and Atlantic Inferno is the episode we covered, and it involves it does involve Penelope and Parker doing a Frank Spencer and moving to Australia for some reason, although it not remotely referred to again in any of the rest of the episodes of the series. But they seem to have, Penelope gets a ranch in Australia and then blows up a mountain. If you want to know what on earth I'm talking about, and yes, there are enormous explosions, of course, then that's a podcast to go listen to. And the last thing, of course, is to say next week we are talking about another massive and expansive railway system. We're talking about Russia's railways, and who could join me to talk about Russia's railways and do an overall vibe check on the situation in Russia's railway system, admittedly pre-invasion of Ukraine. It's Milo Edwards, who had the benefit of living there for a decent whack of time, long enough to do that vibe check. So next week, Milo Edwards joins us to talk about Russia's railways, which will be a delight. It only remains, Chris, for me to just say a heartfelt thank you very much indeed, and to say cheerio from both of us, everyone. Cheerio, cheerio.